It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Jesse Reiser, New York-based architect, educator, and founder of RUR, an architectural office in New York. Jesse flew in late last night from a day of work at the School of Architecture in Princeton. He found some way to get from Princeton to JFK, JFK to LAX. We connected a little before midnight, and he's here for a few hours before he will get on a plane and get back to the office and go to work probably later today. And if you needed any evidence of the extent to which he embodies a belief of the importance of continuity between academic and professional realms, your daily schedule is proof of that. Alongside their many other accomplishments, Nanako Umamoto and Jesse Reiser and all of their collaborators at RUR over the years are and have been deeply committed to moving a disciplinary project of architecture forward on not only academic and professional fronts, but pretty much any front they can find that serves the necessary medium to advance the discipline of architecture. And I offer as an example of that belief in any front, a link that Jesse shared with me at about 5 o'clock this morning of a 2013 short film he in the studio made called Manhattan Memorious, portraying a mid-century newsreel version of mid-century New York, populated by all of the beautiful unbuilt visionary projects of that city as if they had actually been realized. So any medium available to advance the field, and that film really does it, and does it in beautiful ways. About 25 years ago, I and my graduate students in the studio pitched up in a museum in Graz for a show called Latent Utopias, where we were about to install a room full of very beautiful and weird robots and other devices that were one-to-one working prototypes of the projects we were doing that year in the studio. We arrived in the museum, and next door to us was a room that Jesse and about 25 electricians were wiring up to create a magnetic field that would register bodies moving through that space. They were all in hazmat suits and rubber gloves and rubber boots, and it was terrifying. I never went into the room because there was so much electricity in it that regularly throughout the week, the entire museum in that part of Graz would be like shut down by blackouts. It was an absolute perfect record of Jesse's deep belief in the ways in which the stuff we call architecture is the flow and movement of not just matter and energy, but information and bodies like ours moving in space and interacting in ways that he and RUR have built a career around testing the absolute and real limits of. Alongside building and teaching and various other science experiments, Jesse also does a lot of publishing, writing, and lecturing. We're honored and pleased that he can be here today as a part of that larger project. It's been an honor for me over the years to be involved in some of that publishing and writing. Way back in the 90s, unbuilt and I think largely unbuildable diagrams, testing the limits of a first wave of diagrammatic and informational architecture in places like Kansai and a beautiful library that you proposed there. Years later, and in about 2010, I edited a book titled 014, Projection and Reception, I think was the subtitle, that was, first of all, my favorite kind of monograph for being a book about a single building and the life story of a remarkable exoskeleton tower that I still think is not only the heaviest building in the Emirates in that part of the world, but likely the most deliberately massive composition of matter and material in high-rise form anywhere in the world. It was a real thrill to work on, and much of what Jesse and Nanako argued for in the book is about not just how that is a singular project, but that that's a project that very deliberately sits in the larger field of tall buildings, and that disciplinary project of the 20th century that I would argue they brought to a beautiful close at the beginning of the 21st century by almost inverting every one of the architectural habits about what tall buildings are supposed to be. In 2006, RUR's small, all-black Atlas of Novel Tectonics is published. For students that haven't seen it, it's an absolute gem as a mini manifesto. Oh, look, Jimenez, of course, is carrying it in his back pocket. It was designed to go in one's back pocket, which the best of architecture books are. And in fact,
it's the same proportion as the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. As a low-cost, cheap paperback, and it is structured that way with dozens of small chapters, each of which takes on strange topics like materiality and architecture, the debate between art versus architectural histories, etc. It's very digestible. Sorry, I'm just advertising it for everybody here. What it really claims more than anything, and it really is a kind of mini manifesto in a post-digital era, it is a claim for architecture being tectonics, being physical stuff in the world, which for a generation that even then was increasingly living in a world of endless circulation of images, staring at screens, in which physical stuff is turned into information and bits of information, it was an incredibly contrarian, and I would argue incredibly provocative claim that architecture has a longer history than the history of the iPhone or other kinds of media. And that is, I would argue, the project more than any other that RUR continues to make a claim for and to carry forward for all of us. At the end of that book, Jesse and his collaborators in the book make a claim that the flow of energy through a system acts to organize that system. That is a tagline from the front cover of the last issue of the Whole Earth Catalog, which I mention here only to say I think I get to, with this introduction, be the only person to ever make a connection between Princeton in the 21st century and West Coast hippies in the 1970s. But I think there's something to an argument that is that long now within the field that actually provides and grounds a longer history than even Jesse wants to let on most of the time with his own stories. Everybody, please join me in welcoming Jesse.
Brett, that was some introduction. Really happy to be here. And I think it's really the first time I think I've given a talk at USC. And it's great that you're here.
Thank you.
And I'm excited to see, how the school will kind of change and develop around Brett's guidance. Okay.
Sit down. Sit down.
Now. Yeah, the lecture is entitled Weaponized Craft, as you can see, and it was motivated around a show we gave at the A83 Gallery about a year and a half ago. Really, in some sense, it's a kind of summation of attitudes we've developed over the years around projects, because we have been involved in rather large projects, but have a fairly small office and we're actually shrinking. A set of attitudes and tactics for an office that has to tackle a large-scale project, how to survive, how to mediate with much larger entities, but also how to think through issues which have been of enormous interest to us from the beginning. Since we established our collaboration in the late 80s, which was at least more or less 7 years before the digital turn, we were really mainly, analog practice, and how to productively bring that form of thinking and working to the digital, was important and also really a necessity, especially, thinking through how one would even translate a small scale thought or a model into something enormous, and how to kind of to navigate between all the specialties and still retain the qualities of the project that we were after. So one of the abiding interests has been aircraft. And these are, some of the family of planes created at the Lockheed factory by a small group within this larger entity called the Skunk Works. That's not to say that our project is militaristic, but it was super interesting to see how the founder, Kelly Johnson, could kind of circumscribe a small speculative laboratory within a much larger corporate setup and be able to, maintain some control, both in terms of, the quality and the sort of desire for speculative work, within that entity. So he had his own, set of rules and practices. I'm not going to go into that, but simply to say that in working through this idea of the weaponized craft, we began to develop our own, general set of approaches that we use, and those will be scattered through this presentation. The other part of this question of the weaponized craft also has to do with aesthetic issues, which I'll get into as well in the project. So it isn't just, about structuring modes of work and workflows, but it actually impacts, questions of design and aesthetics in the particular buildings that we do. There's a little, I'm sorry. There's a little, sorry. Oh. So I'm going to be talking about 3 projects that we were involved in Taiwan. 2 of them were built, 1 of them wasn't. The Taipei Music Center first, which was won in competition in 2009, 2010. One of the, things that characterized that series of competitions in Taiwan was that they always began not only with, propositions for architecture, but as well the kind of urban impact. There was always an urban design study that would accompany the specific architectural proposal. And in this case, it related to creating a new precinct in Taipei that would be dedicated both to the production and the performance of music, popular music, but also other forms as well. And also to that would take into itself the distributed producers of music, especially in Taipei, and bringing them all together in this new area of called Nangang in Taipei. And it's also a very interesting place because, unlike many Western cities, it seems there is no suburbs, that the city extends to these foothills, and then you get a radical juxtaposition of, albeit kind of modified nature, but nevertheless green space, and urban fabric. So that was something that was really exciting to us to begin to think through that, even to look at the history of that site. Those flat sites, were first in this zone, say between the river and these foothills, were first agricultural sites. They were flat. They were also then, open to development, which I guess during the colonial period, the Japanese ran railroads through those sites. So they're, actually also sites of extraction. And that was part of, the colonial project of the Japanese. And so in a way, those were scarred places. And finally, kind of after the Japanese left, I think this became an industrial area. There was a paint factory. There were various, kinds of buildings, kind of polluted sites as well. And so in a way, we were working in scars in these areas that were kind of scarred between verdant space and city fabric. The site is, close to one of the high-speed rail line and the track zone which you see in the foreground. And you kind of see that it's very centralized. And it was both, again, it's actually two different sites. It's a very long site that you see in the foreground, and then another site, with that the main hall of the music theater. One of the things I could say, this was the competition scheme, which was really radically different from what we finally built. The reason being both, forces from the city, but also because the original theater and complex was created by the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan. And then it went over to the music industry, more or less, who had completely different agenda about the scale and type of performances that they wanted. So this one was the main hall was a 3,000 seat theater at first. And then when it went to the industry, it went to over 5,000 seats. So we had to basically start over after about a year and a half. And we had a robot theater when they estimated which is that this thing moved on rails along the length of the site, so it could be in a way adjusted to the scale of the crowds that they expected, and park space would sort of open park space would follow in its wake. So I think I guess the DSR project in a way kind of follows in a similar logic to the ambitions of that. But when we started to get estimates on the cost of this movable stage, which also was a kind of origami structure, so it also expanded and collapsed, it ended up having a budget higher than the entire project. So that was also, an issue. The project came at a kind of point, just before the advent of social media. That was something that was, there was something very much in terms of the call was for an iconic building, or complex, like many competitions, that would be recognizable, through other media, that you'd be able to see that this production is happening in Taiwan and Taipei by the Taiwanese music industry, because they felt, and I think the government also felt, that Taiwan was under pressure, although they were among the first to produce kind of pop music after Japan. The kind of upsurge in K-pop and in mainland China and so forth meant that they wanted to kind of give a strong identity to their industry and their artists. So this was a complex also that was not so much meant for giant, traveling acts, like U2 would probably go to a stadium. This is more at the scale, say, of Radio City Music Hall, and then smaller venues and clubs as well that would be associated with this. But we, did some initial renderings as if it was shown on various, TV and media, but then it just exploded with social media. They have, the Music Center has a really active organ for promoting themselves. But anyway, the thought here was that I kind of talked about the situation of the site, that we created a kind of artificial ground for the lower fabric of the buildings. And those would contain smaller shops and clubs and venues. And then we had three major object buildings that sit on top of that artificial ground. And actually the main theater, the main hall of the theater, is sort of divided between a kind of groundwork for back of house functions, and then the object, which is more front of house for the theater. But anyway, we were going through a lot of public presentations all along the course of the project. So it required a lot of very actually useful interaction between Ministry of Culture and then planning and community groups as the project developed. There's also something more, I guess, in general, I could say about the two Taiwan projects and the persistence of certain morphological interests, let's say. We proposed a trilobe theater in the first stage of the Music Center. And then when that was not going to happen, we started to rethink the possibility of using that morphology more or less directly in the Kaohsiung project, which I'm going to show later. And the argument that we make comes both from first from a kind of acoustical argument for a trilobe theater, which actually derives from the Rusakov Workers' Theater in Moscow, where you have three shoebox halls fused together. But also, because theaters are both audio and optical organisms, we're in a theater, and that's what this diagram is trying to demonstrate. You're always focusing in on a kind of prime spot in the stage. We realized we could basically reverse the arrows in the port terminal. That would become a kind of convergence point and a point of entry, and that you would be able to then see the major directions towards ships. So this manifold-like form could operate both as an optical device, but also as a kind of volume for movement. And so, we've been basically working on these kinds of problems with the trilobe since the Cardiff Bay Opera House competition, which I believe Zaha won, but never built in the early 90s. This has been kind of an abiding interest. And here, just some of the precedents from Rusakov and Cardiff to the Taipei early scheme, and then the Kaohsiung project, where we kind of bent the whole trilobe towards the water's edge. And there was actually a kind of funny story. I didn't actually start with the, in truth, we didn't even really start with Rusakov. There was a funny technical book called Buildings for Music. And there was a Texas firm that basically used that model of the trilobe. And then only later did I, see the more venerable precedent. It was more this funny technical precedent from a Pomo building. But again, kind of working with a whole network, of people, our architects of record, Fei and Cheng, who were really interesting because they're one of the oldest and largest firms in Taipei, and Philip Fei actually worked with Philip Johnson, so he understood, he worked on the Pope's library staircases, infamous now. But he understood, design practice of a certain kind in America, and he really, in many ways, shepherded the project through years of planning and the kind of real politic that happens, in keeping the projects alive. And yeah, I mean, others from the Ministry of Culture and the Music Center, musicians, and they're all part of it. I mean, the one thing I would want to say pedagogically with this is that it's really important, if you're doing a design in terms of your kind of approach to buildings and sites from our perspective, that you actually have a strong design that you bring to a site, that it's at least, doesn't mean it's fixed and immutable, but that you have something of the design independent of the site that you're working with. And it's the thing that then gets negotiated as opposed to simply thinking that you could visit an empty site, do an analysis, and that it would result, in a significant project. So I always try to argue also that there's a larger notion of context, which is equally the historical context of buildings of this type. So it isn't just you as a kind of single author, but that architecture itself is part of the context and who you're drawing from and what you're trying to extend. Again, yeah, this is all of the kind of process during the 11 or so years in the design, all of those stakeholder meetings and all of that kind of development. In terms of the scheme, I didn't have slides of it, but I think we were one of the only teams, and I guess Brett is aware of this, but I think many of the teams we were competing with were fascinated with a kind of OMA model for thinking about buildings in the city. So, there was a very hard constraint about noise and sound control in the project, which we somewhat ignored in the process. But almost all the other teams enclosed the entire project, probably rightfully, if you were being guided by the acoustical rules of Type A, into one big building. So in effect, all of the projects claimed urbanism within a building. In a way, a kind of representation of the city within the building, which was something REM, I think, was always interested in, or kind of the extension of that. But then there was a kind of practical problem of really making public space. And one of the things that was really important to us was that this project, which contains all of the, the programs of, a 5,000 seat theater, a Hall of Fame, which is that cubic building here, like a very large club and 3 smaller clubs, and then retail, and then a kind of production facility, that all of those would also kind of work in the everyday life of the city. So there would be, it would be porous and open for everyday use, not just for performance. So it couldn't be a single building that could be closed up and be either open or closed, but that they would have to regulate, particularly the outdoor performance space, that when there was a performance, it could be, controlled and ticketed, but otherwise would be open, as a regular plaza. And the other kind of guiding gesture, one could say, was that we wanted to have the 3 object buildings visible almost as silhouettes against the kind of lower fabric buildings, the kind of artificial ground of fabric, and with these elements, clearly visible, so in a way to orient you as well. So this is a kind of rendering which shows the effect that we were looking for, where particularly because a lot of performance happens in the evening or night, that these elements would be kind of seen as silhouettes against the sky. We were also, in a very indirect way, looking at precedents. The stupa, kind of ground form, and then a fascination with the overhanging eaves, even in traditional Chinese and Japanese architecture, although very deliberately trying to create a kind of near miss that you'd never overly reference those things, but kind of in design holding that in intention. And so the ground function, this is a kind of shot of the, this is one part of the groundwork under the main hall. That's the press area, it's kind of vaulted space, ribbed vaulted space, which unfortunately they hung a kind of cheap acoustical ceiling inside of, but we didn't have total control. But anyway, it's there. But yeah, to kind of work around all of the ancillary functions, for loading the theater and all of the kind of technical functions and those sort of press areas, and then keeping the more of the public spaces in the object building. And then this is a plan of that outdoor performance space that can hold like 1,500 people. This is, kind of interested in symmetry and perhaps more of an architect's view, without people. And as I said, there's a very active website and kind of promotion arm of the music center. So this is the architect's view. And then this is how the music center kind of animates the site with all the local gods. Doesn't have sound, but it has sound. I'll move on to that. But it actually does function, independent of, those outdoor concerts. There are demonstrations there. It is, not overly regulated. I think it's doing its job for what I can see. And, this is the same thing with a concert. And it's also being, appropriated for advertising and fashion. And here's an influencer using the site to promote herself. It's kind of fascinating for the architect to witness this. And it's even on a postage stamp as of last week. So these are, things out of the architect's control. But used for kind of strange references to Duchamp, as well as for Audi ads. And again, I think, because we were kind of involved in the use of symmetry, influences on us, like Wes Anderson and Kubrick, the kind of film influences were important to us. Or Italian neorealism, Lone Dog. It's a bi-level theater, so this image is of the lower lobby where they have what do they call them? All of the publicity and lines up of cars, and there's a whole set of functions, tied red carpet. And because we created overhangs, the use of informal urbanism. And this would also be an argument because it happens all the time. At Princeton, all the students want to do this informal stuff. And I argue that you just create a place for it, and the entrepreneurs do it so much better than architects. But to allow a place for that to happen would be the thing. And to draw from really varied sources, because I'm an airplane fanatic and I'm interested in this old types, that when using materials like corrugated, I find references like the Junkers airliner really interesting because it isn't like a way of representing cheap, but rather pushing something like corrugated to the extreme. Like all the details here are just so great. Like they even apparently, this factory was right across the street from the Bauhaus, apparently. So they brought in a lot of Bauhaus students, and Hugo Junkers, the professor, was actually anti-Nazi. Very interesting. He got pushed out of his firm, because they built all of those, infamous planes like the Stuka and all of those things during the war. But prior to that, there was a very close connection between the craftsmen at Bauhaus and the metalworking concern at Junkers. So that was super interesting when thinking through detailing a striated surface. The other thing was also a kind of cultural question, which was interest in these early anodizing. So these are really typical finishes that you see in Japan and I think China too, called alumite. And we use that kind of golden finish on the outside of the music center or something close to it. Because I guess what it was argued early with the airplane that it actually reflected light and atmosphere and was a kind of camouflage. And we thought that was super interesting as a, not the silver of aluminum, but the sort of slightly gold color would be a kind of carrier for color. That also developed over the time of the project. At first, we were looking at flip paint finishes like cars, but there were very few approved flip paints for building finishes that they wouldn't insure it. So we ultimately went to lighting as a way of applying color as opposed to putting color, too much color on the building. This is the second level of the building with Manico in the foreground. There's a kind of bridge which connects across the street to the other site. And so it's sort of a bi-level entrance. So she's looking at that bridge, which crosses the main road and then actually goes into the theater. And this is a kind of lower view from the lower level looking at that bridge. So it's sort of, the galleries are approached from two levels, either people coming from across the street or people getting off of motorbikes or subways and entering the lower level. And then this is a view of the interior of the theater. They can remove the whole row, many rows of seats actually at the lowest level for standing crowds, depending upon the kind of use, the way they want it used. And then the folded wall was kind of interesting because in fact, while it looks like it performs acoustically, it actually doesn't. It's more of an absorptive wall because they also want to record music there. They don't want echoes. They wanted it to be almost acoustically dead. So it's, it produces spatial effects, but it actually doesn't do, what it looks like it's doing. And this was one of the performances. And again, a view of that outside performance space, the cube above. But you can see all of those, object buildings on this horizon and kind of cut out the middle ground of the city. So you would also be able to see the verdant hillsides without the kind of intervening spaces of the rail yard and all of that. Okay, I'm gonna jump to a project that we did in the early 2000s, our first introduction, to Taiwanese competitions. It was called the Alishan Tourist Route, and it's one of the most kind of famous mountains. The Taiwanese people know very well. People go up there, and there's a kind of phenomenon, the bowl of clouds at dawn. And so it's a very popular place. It's reached by a mountain railroad that was originally built, I think, by the Japanese to remove, very large Hinoki pines. They're really ancient trees up there. Still some left that were they were taken for temple columns and that kind of thing. It's part of the colonial extraction project. And there is even a little temple, which was for the Crown Prince of Japan, that was never visited. And it's sort of lying in ruins next to this site. But anyway, we were again, asked to consider not only specific architecture, but they were having problems because it's I think around an 80-kilometer long train line that goes from at practically sea level all the way up to through three climactic zones. They had all of these small stations that were derelict. How to kind of maintain the right of way of the train and develop it in terms of keeping it up, but also how to revive the stations along this line. So this was it was around 2003. It was one of our first forays into a kind of ecological thinking. And we kind of came across this really interesting correlation between altitude and latitude. Where as it says, 1 degree of latitude is equal to a kilometer of altitude. So the first intuition was to kind of look at that gradient of temperature and of growth that would happen in this vertical mountain railroad. And we first correlated it to points on the globe because we were thinking about, it was slightly hokey, I think, but, that we would have restaurants that would be themed to those altitudes. So you could have whatever, French or Scandinavian, depending upon where you were. We then, got a little more sensitive to the site and instead simply looked at what could grow at that altitude, typically in Taiwan, and that there would be a way of thinking through dining and a kind of tourist model relative to this, the altitude and the kind of things that were growing. We tapped into the way the Swiss have their farmers maintain right-of-ways. The agriculture kind of produces, the right-of-way instead of having people do maintenance, that it would be done by the farmers who grow this stuff. There was also a really horrible monoculture of betel nut they were growing, and it was really bad for the soil and a lot of erosion. So that would also, encourage the new modes of farming, special products for restaurants, very limited use. And then we were asked to consider, two major building sites for the architectural part, which would have to kind of, one was at a mid-level and the other one was at kind of the highest, most level. And we developed a whole kind of landscape and architectural proposal that would key into the various modalities. So this is the train, but then there would also be hikers paths, and it would also be connected, to one of the towns that have or had Aboriginal peoples in that area. So I won't go too much into this, but we did a lot of work detailing this project. And unfortunately, there was Well, the train company became privatized. And then there was a natural disaster with a typhoon where this whole site basically, I think, slid into the town below, so that, yeah, there was not much of a site left, and so they stopped, the project. But we did, develop some interesting experiments with structures of grid shells that we used in later projects, and we were able to show those at the Venice Biennale in the early 2000s, a kind of prototype model. This is more a geometry model, I would say. It was sort of a cheat. It was very soft. It was made milled wood, but then they had to put a beam, a kind of stiffener, along its belly in order for it to stay rigid. So yeah, later on we did a double layered grid shell, and that was fine. It's self-stiffened. But you can kind of see that little spine running through the bottom. But these are, yeah, the kind of problems of materiality. Yes, geometry and materiality. All right, the final project I'll show today, also in Taiwan, in the southern city of Kaohsiung. I should just say, kind of overall, there was a desire. There was a larger program within Taiwan to look at post-industrial, sites and the kind of changeover, from a period of heavy industry to lighter industry and more kind of human-based functions and public functions. And the interesting thing here was that it really, in Kaohsiung, it's the largest container port in Taiwan. Strictly not post-industrial, it's got to continue to function. And so our proposal in kind of bringing the program for a ship terminal and the Port of Authority Tower to this site was to think about, how, of course, to design that building, but also to think about how public space would be possible in a totally industrial situation where the ground would be occupied and still have to be used for those purposes. And we built a Lego model for the project, but this is it, in its built form, and you can see a kind of base building and then the figural elements of the tower and the lobes of the port terminal. And we had done a lot of research, design research, very early on. This was a project for the New York Edge, for the East River, that the Van Allen Institute asked us to consider, but they only wanted us to do one building, and then of course we arrogantly said we're going to do 12 miles of the edge of Manhattan. Had to be the whole, big idea. But the thing that inspired us was that, in a sense, Manhattan is a megastructure by default. It's very artificial already. And so we were looking at really successful moments of Manhattan, like the Coral Shirts Park, which is where the mayor's house is, which crosses right over the edge, the FDR Drive, and brings the public right out to the edge. And then we kind of naively thought we could simply extrude that section all the way down 12 miles and then begin to program it. And the programming came from a kind of wish list that the Van Allen people provided us from local community groups. It turned out to be much more complicated than that. There's a constantly changing section of the Manhattan Edge and of levels. And so it became actually more challenging, but more interesting. But anyway, that was, our investigation. So it was about this notion of a multi-layered urbanism. And then we were able to look at a similar situation and proposal for what is now, the rail yard site. And this was a competition that the Canadian Centre for Architecture gave and invited, forgetting we did the book on the man.
Cedric.
Cedric Price, and then Peter Eisenman, UN Studio, Tom Main, to make proposals, which at that time they thought, could become a kind of spur to the way that site might be developed. So, yeah, I mean, I won't go into this too much, but just to say that we were kind of working through the idea of these edge conditions in the city. And so when we were, confronted with the situation at Kaohsiung, we immediately went to a kind of 3D urbanism model. And the first, for the planning side, we proposed this elevated edge that would be public and that could conceivably keep going all around the edge of the harbor. But yeah, very much like a lot of, I guess, Rem Koolhaas's projects, you can only design what you can design. So our project, in a way, is a segment. It's somewhat utopian in that way, but the idea is that that horizontal bar would extend, farther. The situation around the time of the competition was that there would be an expansion, of tourism around, East Asia, and the Taiwanese at that point expected, a lot of tourists from mainland China, which may happen, or I hope they're not, they should stay tourists. But yeah, we had to design, for various types of cruise ships and fast ferries. And we did bring this notion of a kind of sandwich, urban sandwich in general to bear, that there would be an elevated public space. The terminal would sort of slot in to the mid zone, and then, the ground would be given over to the industrial functions of the port and to keep that unimpeded. And that's sort of reflected in the actual section as well of the thing. So there is a kind of split between, I don't know, a kind of more or less rational, extensive model for dealing with those functional issues, and then the kind of introduction of this very figural, three-dimensional kind of architectural form, and how to kind of connect the two together. Really, I mean, in our first phase, we did a more romantic version, something that you would probably find in Manhattan, where people would go from docks up to ships on gangways. And then we went to Arab Logistics and they say, no, it's more or less like an airport. So that, that section is essentially an airport section. And it's the kind of rational machine. And then the, one could say that it was sort of a mind-body split, that would work. They would be fairly functional at the level of all of those uses in the horizontal area. And then the more fantastic spatial exploration happened in the volumes of the space, that you would be moved along in a rational way, but then, the space itself was handling headspace, one could say. We found out the site, the project began and then very quickly stopped because they found oil under the site. This was the big, port for the Imperial Japanese Navy. So the Mitsubishi tank farm was there in the 30s, and it, built, it was servicing the Yamato and all of the great, capital ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And of course, that became a target. So I was able to find, in the National Archives, the targeting map. T4 is our site. And it was bombed in October of 1944. And then all of that oil, if it didn't burn, leached into the ground and was sitting there, up until, 2015. And had to be pumped out. There was also, China Petroleum rebuilt tanks after it spilled more oil. So it's, a historical soup that had to, and remediation of soil till the kind of building actually started. The structure was designed by our former professor of structures at the Cooper Union, Israel Sinek, who, how do I say this, but he was actually Trump's engineer. He did the Trump Tower, he did all, but he also has a history of designing modernist buildings in Cuba. He passed away during the competition, but he was sort of a kind of a Rat Pack character. I think Trump actually paid him. But he was brilliant, and he always gave his money back to Cooper. But here's a quick animation of the construction of the lobes of the tower. So there was a kind of diagrid structure, then kind of connecting to and balancing these large girdered structures. And then a skin that more or less covers and in a way blocks clear readings of all the levels of the project, to kind of work against the scale of the building in an interesting way. Iwan Baan saw the project and photographed it on his own, went into the city, so we were very fortunate. We got such a talented photographer. He was there, had extra time, and then went down. So these are his photographs of the space, but you can sort of see the interior space. In a way, it's we were joking. It's a kind of tubism. It's like being in an exhaust manifold, and these big shafts of space. There was a wonderful sequence in Ferrari where he talks about that film recently. But yeah, thinking of the space as a big kind of instrument as well. So there would be a more or less rational design of the layers, but then the spatial expression is more exuberant. And there's also, very interestingly, we were very cognizant of the problems at Yokohama Port Terminal, where there weren't very many programs when ships weren't in port. So even from the very beginning, we were trying as best we can to program, uses for the building with the city. So this is a kindergarten, which we didn't design the interior of, but it's, in our space. And my mother really loved the fact that there was a kindergarten there, so that a very small child would be able to experience, have a very different idea of what space could be. So it was very nice to hear that. But these are Iwan Baan's shots of the walking around, and he found the most erotic view of he called it the crotch. Architectural porn. And here's the film. Oh, these are more his shots. Sorry. From the boardwalk and also from the sunken interior gardens that we were working through. I guess that's the other thing I would just say in general. There was a really interesting interaction between the object building and this deck, because it doesn't land as typical on one surface. It actually almost breaks through the layers, and so there are multiple points of rest for the building. Some of it, like the tower, appears to sit on the public surface, but the others descend through the section. So when you're in the lobby, you see where the bottom rests there. So it's sort of settling into the section. Yeah. The behemoth in the old city. And then a film, a short film. But the place is being actively used, and you'll see the lower drop off is used for a market. You know, when they're not dropping off passengers. There it is. So in a strange way, it's almost Roman. Thank you.
Everybody, want to do some questions? Who we got? There we go, Fred. Betsy, thanks so much. That was great. Everybody, just got a few minutes. Questions from any of you? Yeah.
Jesse, thanks so much for your wonderful talk. When you went to school, it was sort of a very stressful time period, and also who you went to school, like who you were influenced by, right?
Right.
And I also have read the way in which you talk about Rossi's influence on Hayduck around the time when you went to school as well. You know, you were, I guess, in grad school when Libeskind was. The digital wave, this idea of the total fluidity began to even in the Axon polyfluid project, and if we read the plan, it's so consistent what the rest of the body's work came from. I just wanted to have an opportunity to ask you about you and that time period.
He overlapped it. I mean, I have our own personal kind of story about it, because we had a show at Columbia of our kind of earlier competition work, like Cardiff show. And Hayduck came up to Columbia, which was for him like enemy territory. And in fact, he came dressed in one of those, what do they call those, hunting coats with a fur collar cinched up, and it was only early October. So he thought that nobody would recognize him. This guy was almost 7 feet tall. But anyway, yeah, he was, you could see him from a mile off, but he didn't want to be seen by Bernard, and there was a kind of a tension between the two. Bernard was actually a teacher of mine and Stan Allen's at Cooper. So yeah, I don't know, there was some sense of betrayal. I don't know, craziness. But Bernard, Hayduck liked our show, and it did contain a fair amount of digital work. And he said he wanted to show it at Cooper Union, but then he made very strong provisions that there be no indication that any digital work was present. because he didn't want it to come into the pedagogy. I think it was wrong, and I even suggested, because we were helping Hader at that time too. We were drawing, he would do the design, but we were drafting the victims of the Gestapo project. And then I thought, I had a brilliant idea. We could, draw and animate victims, which he hated it. But I think he would, I think under different circumstances, maybe he would have embraced the total fluidity idea as a digital project, but it was just not. I don't know. There was probably politics and ideology attached to that too. And there was also a lot of lousy digital work, and I kind of understand, especially at that time.
Hey, Jesse, I doubt I even need this, but welcome here. Just to check, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I hear you.
Okay.
All right.
So obviously amazing work. I was very interested though to see what seems to me an obvious development from, and this is a follow-on, I guess, to Jimenez's question.
Yeah.
From the first project you showed to this one here.
Mhm.
Understandably, the first project was larger and having been broken into, or not broken into, but composed of several pieces.
Right.
Yet it had a very strong mandate to perform urbanistically.
Right.
And that was one of the, say, winning formulas that you used.
Right.
And you expressed that beyond the sort of artificial landscape thing.
Right.
In three distinct volumes and in their distinction was not only spatial, but formal.
Right.
As well. This project, however, at the other end of the spectrum is again, very fluid and
Right.
cohesive. All the pieces connect together and everything. So I'm wondering, for the students, from an urbanistic standpoint, what would you suggest was, I don't know, the better strategy to employ? A cohesion or coherence among all the various pieces of the pie that you're working with,
Right.
or more of this sort of OMA approach of, or Hayek approach of different elements scattered around.
Right. I don't know if I could split it so easily. One of the things, this is like a retrospective reading of the FOA port terminal, was I realized that what it needs now is an object. Like it was so lateral. It's, it works. It's very, as an extensive thing, but in a way, the intuition, well, if one could call our fluid thing an object still, that those things work together really well. There was a kind of ideological, as this insane ideological desire to make everything continuous and, to deal with no discreteness, which, or ideally thin continuity too, which is also kind of a problem. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but we use both. And I think in a funny way, the Taipei project, even though it was begun earlier, the discrete arguments came later. So maybe we were heading that way. I felt in a way constrained by just the desire for, continuity. But there were other things too. There were something that actually Neil Denari ran into. I think when he did his port terminal, which finally didn't go ahead, that he was dealing with multiple clients and contracts. And so that worked against a continuous project. And we were lucky with the Kaohsiung project that it was more or less Ministry of Transportation, and they were engineers, and it was going to be one thing. But yeah, I mean, I think on a practical level, there's also this problem of stream continuity, but if you can do it, I mean. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is so beautiful seeing the work, especially, I mean, this last project, seeing it, of course, published, and it's so elegant. You can see the progression of the work, and thank you for sharing that. I love so many comments in this lecture, especially the kind of bringing this autonomous typology to the site specificity of the work. So you're bringing that type and you have the site condition. It's like, I mean, this is like Sydney Opera House kind of condition like that. And that's just,
And it even evolved in Australia. I mean, later I
Yeah,
looked
yeah.
and that, I guess the first scheme for Sydney was just a roof.
yeah, yes.
And the same thing happened
Yeah.
in our halfway point.
Yeah. And
It
you
was
bring,
more or less a surface thing and, you know, a volume, but it was more about the roof. And then only later did we really make it fully volumetric.
yeah, you know, it's beautiful in that way. I had a
Um,
question, maybe going back to some of the sources and some of your inspiration.
Right.
I've talked to some of your colleagues on the United Architects team,
Uh-huh.
for the, Greg and Farshid and,
Yeah.
and Ben and all. And I was just, it was such an exciting time there when you were all collaborating on that, and clearly the work, you guys are talking to each other in so many different ways and
Uh-huh.
bringing up FOA and Yokohama and all
Right.
that. How did that, to like that opportunity to formally collaborate with your friends in that way and to do that, to like, how did that impact the work, you know, in moving forward? I'm curious about that.
It was a very difficult collaboration. It looked like the dream team, but internally it was challenging. I shouldn't say too much.
It was like your hometown. I mean, you were sort of.
Well, we were, yeah, I mean, we had to deal with, the rent after they all cut out. So I have to say, UN Studio were really honorable at all levels. Yeah.
Hey Jesse, I think one of the biggest questions I have, to go back to the title, weaponized craft,
Yeah,
as a longtime student and still continued badgering of you for writing forwards and afterwards and all that stuff for my own books. I'm just very curious about your definition of craft. Because this is something that you really pedagogically do in the work.
right,
I guess largely from your body of work till now,
right.
what's next is my biggest question.
Oh, I don't know about what reading them. I mean, I could say that I was really trained literally as a craftsman before going to architecture school. I was doing metalsmithing jewelry, and I think that had an impact on, you know, a very literal craft. And then there was, you know, how that then, I guess in a general sense, the argument is that since there are, you know, fewer and fewer trained craftsmen on the job site, that has migrated to the architects. And that you do it digitally, or, you know, that there was a way of kind of transferring those sensibilities or that way of working to the digital realm. So, I mean, but that's a more general statement. I mean, the other thing that I think we find, which is a constant, because we're in a way, we are like, also like handcrafting models, which is, I guess, probably similar to the problem of Gary, but, you know, slightly different, is that we actually don't like a lot of the routines and the rationalization that the purely kind of computational routines give. We're always trying to somehow break out of it or in some kind of tension with it. So it's a constant battle. You know, and we don't, you know, and I think a lot of at least the students or the architects will use the computation as a kind of justification because it somehow in general is a rationalizing process. But yeah, I mean, we got in trouble, or so it had conflicts at Arup with engineers who said, it was sort of a derogatory term. Oh, your project is a crafted project. Like, this is, we can't really optimize it that well, we can't rationalize it that well. So literally what's happening though is it's like the beautiful places are where the systems break down. I mean, in terms of the aesthetic, like these stitches and like not to try to close everything up or totally perfectly map panels, but that kind of tension between the rationalizing processes and then what the form is doing actually produces interesting effects architecturally. So I think that's where, and we had a similar problem with the gentleman Roland Snooks when we were doing, he was helping us on the O14 tower and was scripting gradients. But it, I don't know, once you kind of, and it was sort of more or less a single rule first, and then it looked dead. I don't know, it's more a kind of a problem of, in music, I think they talk about this. I read a David Byrne piece that talks about just that you'd never, you'd never really be working within a single rule, and you're always trying to kind of push against, those routines. So we got into a situation with Roland where we were demanding more and more and more localized rules. So it became absurd. And he was convinced we were interested in randomness, which was nuts. I'm getting crazy. But yeah, but and we finally, I think, used Photoshop. That it was actually more, we had the rules from Sinek about parameters and distances between holes and where the forces would go, but we finally went to graphical solutions to actually design the holes, the spacing of the holes. Yeah.
Thanks, Jesse. We've got one last question, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for speaking today. It was great seeing the work, like talked about, and just seen it briefly in magazines and stuff. This is awesome. I wanted to follow up on the questions of craft. 2 weeks ago, we were lucky to have Tom Main here speaking about his model book and a lot of issues of, he spoke a lot about craft and kind of the future of what he went through and kind of the transition.
Right.
He spoke basically about how in his projects that he ends up having to take almost like legal liability over the parts of the buildings that are produced in order to get them built.
Right.
And he gets, the office is now kind of operating as almost like an independent contractor in certain kind of parts of the building.
Right.
Can you describe maybe some of your experiences building and the 3 projects you showed? Like the bridge is quite detailed, for instance. I don't know how involved you were.
Right. No, I mean, there were similar situations with the cladding at the music center where they would refuse to honor the warranty with certain details. And so, yeah, there were arguments back and forth about, putting caps on certain areas. And I mean, yeah, there were issues like that. I think these are all in Taiwan, so we probably didn't, it's not as regulated as the States, although it's pretty, but it was more on products, I think. Like having to get around these kinds of issues. I don't think if there was anything else that, I mean, there were interesting sort of workarounds. It's not exactly Tom's thing, but that you've run into funny monetary problems with, we designed a lot of very subtle curvature in the cladding of the music center that suddenly wasn't there in the drawing set that was for building, because our local architect wisely removed those because it would be pushed out of the budget. We would, there was like 3 strikes and you're out. That there were 3 chances to bid. And if you lost the 3rd bid, the project was over. So they, selectively removed a lot of our details. And then we're suddenly shocked when, stuff started happening. And also, yeah, I mean, there were similar problems, with cladding, like the, middle management people thought that they had to roll all of those subtle curves, and then we solved it on the job site. They just could push panels into place and get those curves without having to roll them, which then, kind of reduced the budget, enormously. So, yeah, it's not exactly the same thing, but, there were interesting breaks like that.
Jesse, thank you for coming in. There was so much.